Hello, and welcome to Ask Dr. Dawn. The opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers, and this is a program intended for education and entertainment. It should not be construed as a substitute for a medical consultation. A few weeks ago, I came across this article, a long description of the processes involved in the upper gastrointestinal tract, and I found myself visualizing. I'm a very visual reader, and being in the mouth and looking at the saliva coming out of the saliva glands and standing there sort of knee-deep in saliva, and then the swallowing action. And I began to think what fun it would be to pretend to be a docent taking you on a guided tour, just like you might get a guided tour through a French chateau or a British manor house, describing the interesting points and telling you a little story about various peculiarities of the architecture and so on. So I decided to give a try. I hope you enjoy this whimsical overview, including, of course, the theme park ride version of the human swallow. I wish I had had time to give it sound effects. You're up to your own imagination and your own visual powers. That's up to you. Hope you enjoy. Well, howdy, folks. Nice to see you. And we'll be ready for our tour in just a moment. But before we go through the gate of the upper gastrointestinal tract, I'd like to point out a few things. Actually, the real beginning of the intestinal tract, especially the upper gastrointestinal tract, is invisible. It begins in our nose and our brain. When our eyes see food, that triggers a reflex. The smell of food and the sensation of food at the gate, that is to say our lips, is one of the several of the stimuli which trigger the initiation of digestion. The digestive process is very complicated, but it begins with the secretion of saliva through the saliva glands in the mouth. When a person is upset or nervous, they'll often experience a dry mouth. That's a bad time to try to consume food because you don't have the enzymes in your saliva, and you don't have much saliva at that, to actually start breaking down the food as you should. The first step in digestion is the consumption and chewing of food in the mouth. Think of the mouth as the airlock into the gastrointestinal tract. It's important that whatever comes through the airlock actually be, well, in the case of a space airlock, you want the pressures to be equalized. In the case of the oral airlock, you want the substance to be liquefied and homogenized through proper chewing. If that doesn't happen, then extra processing has to occur in the stomach. This delays stomach emptying and can often lead to heartburn because the incessant recurrent digestion, the incessant recurring contractions of the stomach as it tries to grind up the food into a homogeneous slurry, well, that tends to put stress on the second gate, which we'll be passing in just a moment. But first, follow me, and we'll go from the mouth into the throat. As we pass through this throat, you'll notice these strap-like muscles all around you. The strap-like muscles lift the throat as you swallow, and that causes a trap door to flap down over the entrance to the airway, the trachea, preventing aspiration. This swallow also triggers a series of pulsatile movements, rather like an earthworm, wringing the esophagus and squeezing the bolus of food down through the esophagus until it reaches the lower esophageal sphincter. Take a look here. It's very interesting because the lower esophageal sphincter is actually a donut-shaped muscle that opens and closes rather like the iris of your eye. When it senses that a bolus has arrived in the lower esophagus, it opens up and lets that glop drop down into the stomach, which has prepared a nice acid bed in order to begin the process of breaking down fats and proteins. pH of the stomach during this process drops sometimes to below a pH of 1. It's really amazing that the stomach can handle that kind of a pH. That would burn a hole through your skin and be very painful, but the stomach is built to take it. But since we're not built to handle it, we need to do a little safety check before we jump down the throat, so to speak. So please check to make sure that you have your boogie board and that your acid-resistant gloves are attached to your bodysuit, that your head covering is tight, and that your face shield is snapped down, and that everything is attached. You shouldn't be able to feel any of the ambient wind coming in through any openings, and that's the breathing you're feeling, by the way. All right, so I guess we're ready to start. We'll line up over here, and we're going to move into the swallow. Now I'm going to trigger a swallow, and we're going to find ourselves sliding down a passageway. Notice the flap that comes down as we crest the hill. That's called the epiglottis, and as the muscles pull our throat up, that epiglottis is snapping down to cover the airway. Otherwise, we'd be dropping into the lungs instead of dropping into the stomach. Okay, here we go. And here we are in the esophagus. I want you to notice the sort of earthworm-like contractions that are taking place here at a very low level constantly. When a person has chewed and swallowed a bolus of food, those contractions will get much tighter, almost like a drawstring purse drawing together and then pulling along. Sort of reminds me of milking a cow, if you ever have done that at one of those fine farm tours that are held throughout the country. That squeezing motion is similar to what's going on with the esophagus as it literally pulls the food down into the stomach. Yonder you'll see a round donut-like bulge that's sort of gathered up into a rosette. That is a very important organ. We're going to jump through that when the next swallow comes along. I'll alert you to that, and we'll do one last safety check. But the lower esophageal sphincter is what's responsible for keeping that acid in the stomach. If it falls down on its job and that acid splashes up here into the esophagus, over time, that can lead to esophageal cancer. So we want to be very careful about not lying down immediately after eating. In fact, you know the old thing about don't swim right after eating? Well, it should be don't snooze right after eating, because when you go horizontal, it makes the work of that iris muscle much, much tougher. Okay, here comes the swallow, and as that bolus comes through, just insert yourself into it, hold on to your board, and we'll swirl right down through that opening. Don't worry, the LES, the sphincter, is going to open right up as soon as we get there, and we'll just pop right down into the stomach. Here we go. Okay, now we're just floating on our boards, and we're in a sizzling pool of food and stomach acid. The pH of the stomach can go as low as 1, and it can remain like that for several hours. Approximately 3,000 milligrams of hydrochloric acid are produced in the course of digesting a single banquet-type meal. Isn't that amazing? Now look around and notice the walls. Over there, you see the parietal cells, and that substance that's sort of sweating off the surface of the parietal cells, that's hydrochloric acid, and it's going to drop down into the pool and assist with the digestive process. Notice that the stomach is starting to contract, squeeze and open, and squeeze and open. It actually always reminds me of the rotational agitation of my washing machine. And that's really similar in terms of the purpose of the two things are to agitate something and change its nature, shaking the dirt loose from the clothes that are dirty, but also just helping break down the particles in the food into smaller and smaller and smaller particles until the particles become molecules that can be digested, that can be, I should say, absorbed through the walls. So they have to be very small before the body can grab them and suck them through the walls and get them into the bloodstream and, well, into the rest of us, right? As you look at the surface, notice the thick layer of mucus. The interesting thing about the mucus is it's not actually quite touching the epithelium of the stomach. Instead, it's floating on a very thin layer of bicarbonate. So even if the mucus fails to keep the acid out, the bicarbonate is there to neutralize it. And we've always seen ulcers in humans, and there are some natural causes for ulcers, such as extreme stress. In the case of a person who is in a lot of pain or in extreme stress, they may actually develop what are called stress ulcers. High doses of cortisol might be given in the forms of drugs, also increase the risk of the formation of these stress ulcers. We now know that there is a bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, which causes gastritis and also ulcers by altering acid secretion. Interestingly, if you have chronic H. pylori infection, you will burn out your acid-producing cells, and you'll have irritation because of that. But a small percentage of people will actually get gastric ulcers, not just gastritis, which is rather like a sunburn, but actually a hole being burnt through the stomach. That's only about 15% of people. In those cases, damage to the mucosal wall sets off a chain reaction that elevates gastrin, which stimulates hyperchlorhydria. In that situation, there's a possibility that there will be enough acid in the mix that it will not be suitably neutralized when it finally does leave the stomach, and that can lead to duodenal ulceration. Another thing that leads to ulceration in the duodenum is use of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories. Nonsteroidals have two methods of doing this. One of them is directly acting as an irritant, and as it does that, it itself can create flaws in the mucus and the endothelium. And of course, I've already mentioned the other way, in that because nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories given even systemically, even if they get through the stomach without causing damage, they get into the bloodstream and trigger a reduction in the production of the protective mucus. So really a 1-2 punch. Now, there are two drugs that we often use for this hyperacidity condition. One class of drugs are called histamine receptor blockers, antihistamines, but they are not the same that you take for a runny nose. These types of antihistamines actually block the H2 receptor found in the gastrointestinal tract and also, interestingly enough, in your skin. That's why if you have hives and the H1 drugs like Benadryl aren't doing everything you need, you could try adding one of those H2 drugs, which are sold over next to the antacids, to see if maybe that 1-2 punch can work both ways. The other class of drugs that helps reduce stomach acid is a class of drugs called proton pump inhibitors. They go right to the source, the sodium ATPase pumps that create the gradient in the parietal cells to make the acid in the first place. Given in large doses, they can pretty much turn off 90% of stomach acid production. Over time, this can have a negative effect on B12 absorption, which requires acid, and also calcium absorption, which also requires acid. So we have to be careful with long-term use of something so powerful as this. Another long-term effect of proton pump inhibitors is because they are inhibiting the parietal cells from making their programmed product, hydrochloric acid, the parietal cells multiply and hypertrophy and get bigger and more numerous because they're trying to do their job, which is to make the gastric acid. So we inadvertently cause an overgrowth of the gastric cells, which can be observed in humans after about a year. And in certain animals, but not in humans, it can actually lead to a type of tumor called a gastrinoma. But again, this has not been observed in humans. Well, I see, and I'm sure some of you have observed, that the fluid that we're floating in has changed from when we first came and is now pretty uniform and a little bit soupy, but more like a smoothie than a vegetable soup. So now we're going to look over there, and you'll see the pylorus, another sphincter-like gate, similar to the lower esophageal sphincter. It's at the other side of the stomach, and you'll notice that it's starting to open and allow a little bit of the fluid to drain out and then close. It's open for about the count of 3 seconds, so we're going to be going through there one by one and then stopping immediately on the other side and letting the rest of the group catch up. Let's go on over to the pylorus, and now as it starts to open, insert yourself into the stream, bump up against it so that as it opens, you just get slid right through. There you go. Bye. All right. Next. And again, I turned off my recorder there for a moment since we want to be sure that we've got everyone together before we describe the next chamber. This is the duodenum. This is an extremely important mixing point for the digestive process. So I want you to take a look over there, and you'll notice that big opening in the wall, and that is the common bile duct. Okay, this is very important because it is a mixing center for things coming from 3 different organs: the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So we're going to start with the pancreas because I find it the most interesting. And all of the things we're going to talk about are all critical for proper digestion. We consume so many different things, not just nutrients, but also fiber, other non-digestible materials, a fair amount of bacteria, plant viruses, dirt, all sorts of things. And they all need to be dealt with, either through disposal as waste, or extraction and then disposal, or complete assimilation. And it is amazing how complicated and also how efficient the body is at getting this rather daunting task done. All right, so the pancreas produces digestive enzymes, chiefly enzymes that break down fat, enzymes that break down protein. The trypsin and chymotrypsin are the 2 main protein breakdown enzymes, and they're like little molecular scissors that chop up proteins into their component amino acids. Most proteins are going to be absorbed a little bit downstream in the small intestine, where they'll go through the wall, carried by little carrier proteins that just grab them, pull them through, let them loose, turn around, grab another one, pull it through, and that uses energy. Let's stick with the lipase and the chymotrypsin and the trypsin for a moment, because I want you to think about this. This stuff dissolves meat. We're made of meat. Our pancreas is meat. And so just like the gastric mucosa, the pancreas has amazing self-protective powers that allow it to basically hide from its own digestive corrosive acids so that it doesn't get digested itself. These compounds are made in the pancreatic acini and then secreted into the ducts, and then as you digest food, a hormone, a chemical signal, tells the pancreas to release these compounds, and they blurp down into this fluid that we're floating in. Over there, behind that wall, is your gallbladder. There's a faintly purplish color to the ceiling there. You're looking at the lower dome of the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is basically a muscular sac that contains bile. It's not a strictly necessary organ, but in ancient times it was extremely important because we would go through periods with our diets, as when we were in a primitive pre-agricultural state, where we might eat exclusively nuts and fats over a short period of time, and then subsist on starch and tubers, roots, for a long period of time, and then suddenly have to, bring down a gazelle and then digest a banquet of meat. And the body had to have somewhere to put all of those proteases and fat, well, in the case of the gallbladder, fat-dissolving compounds, detergents, saponifiers they're called. But bile is a superb detergent. Gets grease out of the way, turns it into tiny bubbles, and those tiny bubbles can be digested. So glops of fat come from the stomach and get turned into soap suds by the bile. The bile is also made in the liver and stored in the gallbladder, but if you don't have a gallbladder, your liver compensates and makes the bile, and it all comes down the common bile duct and drops into the duodenum. Okay, folks, so now that we're out of the stomach, feel free to loosen your wrist wraps. You can even take your gloves off if you choose. You could take off your face plates. I do recommend leaving your nose filters in place. It can get a little gassy in here, but for the most part, you can feel like you're in a much more benign environment henceforth. The small intestine is where most of everything that we need gets absorbed. About 95% of the food particles and nutrients, vitamins, fats, etc., all of that is going to be taken care of by the small intestine. And as you might imagine, if you got such a big job, you need a lot of area to do it. So we're in a tube that's about 23 feet long, divided into three parts called the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But look at those walls, right? Do they not remind you of Grandma's shag rug carpeting? Well, indeed they should, because the small intestine has an enormously greater surface area than it would just as a 24-foot long tube. It is actually a multiply folded surface. Every single one of those villi, each one of the pile in the shag rug, so to speak, is a functional surface area. So it's been calculated that if we took the inside of the small intestine and stretched it flat, that the area of the surface would actually be about a doubles tennis court. But it's all scrunched up, so it's just this tube, and all manages to fit in the abdomen. Now, it does also have a muscular layer, but not as intense as that of the esophagus. But again, you have peristaltic movement, very much now like the lazy movement that you see with an earthworm. Occasionally, you'll see a strong peristaltic wave during the sleep cycle especially. But for the most part, it's a gentler river from here on out. The duodenum is the place where we're going to be getting most of our iron. And just a little trick about iron absorption. If you want to be sure you're getting enough iron, you want to have vitamin C with your iron. That puts the iron into an appropriate state that allows it to be absorbed much more readily. I'm told by some experts that rose hips vitamin C is the best one for that, but I haven't really read the papers. You can also get some sodium and some potassium and a fair amount of your calcium in the duodenum. Now we're moving into a slightly different area. This is the jejunum, and this is the primary site for the absorption of most nutrients. Up there in the duodenum, I forgot to mention, you also saw the excretion of a type of enzyme called disaccharidases. So what these do is they chop up sugar, like sucrose, into glucose. They chop up starch molecules, and they're trying to get things down to absorbable single carbon fragments or single ring fragments. So sugars are either 5 or 6 carbons in a ring, and those are small enough to be readily absorbed, but you have to chop them up. And that's what happens with the disaccharidases that are secreted in the duodenum. By the time we get down here to the jejunum, that's all happened. And so now those carbohydrates are ready to be picked right up and deposited into the energy flow that heads straight for the liver, where additional decontamination takes place before it's released into the bloodstream. So now those proteins have been broken down by the trypsin and chymotrypsin into their component amino acids. The fats have been broken up into fatty acids. Most of the vitamins, both water and fat soluble, are taken up in the jejunum, and this is especially a major site for folic acid absorption. Folic acid's extremely, extremely important for your physiological health. The final segment is the ileum, and this is especially there to absorb the B12 and the bile salts. Those bile salts have also been impacted by bacteria along the way, and some of them have been turned into bile acids. And bile acids are another thing that you need for your health. But in terms of the B12, that can only be absorbed if the stomach is able to excrete a protein called intrinsic factor. So if the stomach's healthy and there's enough acid in the situation, you'll get that intrinsic factor. It'll grab onto the B12 when it's floating around freely in the jejunum, and then direct it to the appropriate section of the ileum where it can be absorbed. And just like folic acid, B12 is critically important for basic physiology. Just the list of things that the B vitamins do is very long, but B12 is critical to your nerves. And of course, that's who does our talking, right? Our brain. Now, throughout the small intestine, water, sodium, potassium are being absorbed, and really almost everything gets absorbed, but that remaining 5% that's undigestible fiber, that's going to go into our large intestine, and we don't have time for the tour of the large intestine today, but feel free to come back some other time, and I'll be happy to put you into your environment suit and take you spelunking. But for now, it's time for me to say goodbye, and I hope you enjoyed your tour of the upper gastrointestinal tract. On this pre-recorded program, we're going to cover some topics that seemed a little too long for use on the program when it is a call-in show, because I like to pick up those calls when they come through, and that can really break the pace of a complex topic. We're going to talk about pancreatic cancer, which remains one of the most difficult to treat cancers, partly because it's usually found so late. Pancreatic cancer, like all cancers, is protean, meaning that it's highly variable and adaptive, changing its behavior and its appearance in response to its environment and in response to its treatment. This adaptability is a major reason why pancreatic cancer remains so challenging to diagnose and treat. Pancreatic cancer is a deadly disease, often diagnosed late and frequently resistant to treatment. Unfortunately, it is rising in incidence and is projected to become the second leading cause of cancer death in the U.S. by 2030. It is currently responsible for 1/6 of all cancer diagnoses in the United States, but it is responsible for 1/3 of the cancer deaths. One might ask, why is it so difficult to treat? Well, first of all, there's really no such thing as pancreatic cancer. Just about every pancreatic cancer case is unique, and even within the same patient, there can be different populations of pancreatic cancer with different properties, particularly after metastasis. Even within a single pancreatic tumor, there may be substantial genetic variation that can affect response to therapy. Furthermore, pancreatic cancer adapts quickly, evades the immune system, and resists most conventional therapies. How does it do this? The secret weapon of pancreatic cancer is called the tumor microenvironment. A helpful metaphor for the tumor microenvironment in pancreatic cancer is to imagine a medieval castle surrounded by a deep, fortified moat. The castle itself represents the pancreatic cancer cells, but this castle is protected by an unusually thick and complex moat, made not just of water, but of dense, tangled barriers like thorn bushes, and by watchful armed guards. In pancreatic cancer, the moat is the desmoplastic stroma, a tough fibrous tissue made up of cancer-associated fibroblasts, collagen, and hyaluronic acid. This barrier is so formidable that it blocks most medicines and immune cells from ever reaching the castle. Within the moat, there are also hidden sentries and traps. Some immune cells themselves have been tricked, exhausted, or reprogrammed. Some cancer cells secrete chemical signals that suppress the body's natural defensive attack. Instead of helping the body's army fight the cancer, these cells often help the castle hide and grow stronger. The environment is also low in oxygen and nutrients, forcing cancer cells to adapt and become even more aggressive. Like a castle that has learned to survive under siege, what does not destroy you makes you stronger. Unique to pancreatic cancer's castle, secret underground tunnels run along the nerves. This is called perineural invasion. These tunnels allow the cancer to spread stealthily and cause severe pain, much like a castle sending out raiding parties through hidden passageways. Because the tumor microenvironment is so effective at protecting pancreatic cancer, many new therapies are focused on breaching or reprogramming this protective barrier. The moat is made of dense scar-like tissue, immune cells, and chemical signals that block medicines and protect against immune attack. So here are some of the strategies that are being employed. KRAS mutations, sometimes called the master switch. Over 90% of pancreatic cancers have mutations in the KRAS gene, which acts as a master switch for cell growth and survival. Think of KRAS as a general growth accelerator that turbocharges the growth of the cancer when more copies are present than normal, but also the growth of the fibroblasts in the cancer that form that desmoplastic stroma. Thus, KRAS makes the moat deeper, thicker, and more poisonous to the immune system's attack. In addition, KRAS causes the tumor to make more CD47. CD47 is the "don't eat me" signal, which prevents macrophages from clearing the cancer cells. With this knowledge, we are developing KRAS G12C inhibitors. Drugs like sotorasib or adagrasib are now being tested in humans with early phase trials showing partial responses in selected patients. Some people inherit a genetic factor called Lynch syndrome, which increases their risk for pancreatic cancer due to faulty DNA repair genes. Lynch syndrome carriers also have very high rates of colon and ovarian cancer, and other cancers as well. In this and other faulty DNA repair genes, each cell division throws a loaded dice to unlock and release oncogenes. These genes are active during fetal growth, but turn off in adulthood. The reactivation of these embryonic genes lead to uncontrolled growth, the ability to summon new blood vessels, the ability to migrate, and many other properties that don't belong in a mature adult body. Failure to correct these typographical errors that have allowed these genes to reactivate is the vulnerability of those with Lynch syndrome. About 25% of people with pancreatic cancer have this kind of innate vulnerability. We'll touch on some of the other risks for pancreatic cancer at the end of this discussion. Up to 25% of pancreatic cancers harbor actionable molecular alterations, most notably in DNA damage repair, sometimes called DDR pathways. BRCA1 and 2, BRCA1 and 2, as they're often called, known mostly for breast cancer, also convey a risk for pancreatic cancer. There's a class of drugs called PARP inhibitors, and these have shown significant benefit as maintenance therapy for patients with germline BRCA mutations, prolonging progression-free survival. Some variation on these inhibitors may also work in pancreatic cancer related to Lynch syndrome. One important new cancer therapy you've been hearing a lot about recently, CAR T-cell therapy, which has proved miraculous for leukemia and multiple myeloma, fails in pancreatic cancer because the T-cells can't get across the moat of the tumor stroma. Another important class of new cancer drugs, immune checkpoint inhibitors, rev up the immune system and overcome the inhibition of the immune system the cancer creates. But again, in pancreatic cancer, one agent isn't enough most of the time. But combination therapies have begun to emerge which demonstrate effective response rates of up to 67% and median overall survival exceeding 20 months in early trials. Our next story comes from Science magazine a few years ago, February 2022 to be exact. I'm going to read the first couple of paragraphs verbatim, and then we'll skip around a little bit. On a warm Wednesday morning in October, Herman Poncer puts on a wrinkled lab coat, adjusts his mask, and heads into his lab at Duke University, hoping to stress out a student. An undergraduate named Christina is resting on a lab table with her head in a clear plastic hood. Poncer greets her formally and launches into a time-honored method to boost her blood pressure. He gives her an oral math test. Start off with the number 1022 and subtract 13 until you get to 0, he said, speaking at full volume to be heard over the clanking air conditioner. If you make a mistake, we'll have to start over again. Are you ready to go? 2009, 997. Start over, Poncer barks. Christina, who is signed up for a stress test, laughs nervously. She then tries again and gets to 889, only to have Poncer stop her. This happens again and again. Then, Poncer asks her to multiply 505 by 117 out loud. By this point, she is clenching her sock-clad toes. Postdoc Zane Swanson and undergrad Gabriel Butler monitor her heart rate and how much carbon dioxide she exhales into the hood. Then, Poncer asks a series of questions designed to boost a student's stress levels. What is her dream job, and what exactly is she going to do after graduation? It's just another day in the Poncer lab, where he and his students measure how much energy people expend when they are stressed, exercising, or mounting an immune response to a vaccine, among other states. By measuring the CO2 in Christina's breath, he's finding out how much energy she has burned while coping with math anxiety. Since the publication of Poncer's 2021 book, Burn, new research blows the lid of how we really burn calories, lose weight, and stay healthy. Poncer has been happy to expound on weight loss on the Dr. Oz show and NPR, But his real mission is to understand how alone among the great apes, humans manage to have it all, energetically speaking. We have big brains, lengthy childhoods, many children, and long lives. The energy budget needed to support those traits involves trade-offs he's trying to unravel between energy spent on exercise, reproduction, stress, illness, and vital functions. The answers coming from their data are surprising. Exercise doesn't help you burn more energy on average. Active hunter-gatherers in Africa don't expend more energy daily than sedentary office workers in Illinois. Pregnant women don't burn more calories per day than other adults after adjusting for body mass. In the early 2000s, scientists knew very little about humans' total energy expenditure, also called TEE, the number of kilocalories a person's 37 trillion cells burn in 24 hours. They knew BMR, basal metabolic rate, was roughly the same among larger animals when adjusted for body size. So although BMR only captures 70% of total energy use, researchers figured that, pound for pound, humans burn energy at roughly the same rates as other apes. But humans have an added energy expense. Our big brains, which account for 20% of our energy use per day. There's been a lot of research out there on primates, comparing them to humans, but realistically, it's all speculative. They talk about locomotor adaptations in hominids, efficiency, power, strength, but Ponser decided to go back to basics, measuring the calories expended by humans and animals walking and running on treadmills. Mammals use oxygen to convert sugars from food into energy, with CO2 as a byproduct. The more CO2 a mammal exhales, the more oxygen and calories it has burned. This is the basis for the VO2 max test that you may have seen illustrated on television or in films, which are used to show a person's VO2 max as an index of how much oxygen they can burn and thus their overall fitness. In 2007, while working on his PhD thesis, Ponser studied how much CO2 dogs and goats exhaled while running. He found, for example, that dogs with long legs used less energy to run than corgis. Ponser still measures exhaled CO2 to get at calories burned in a particular activity, as he did with Christina's stress test, but he found that physiologists had developed a better way to measure total energy expenditure over a day, the doubly labeled water method. People drink a harmless cocktail of labeled water, which contains distinct isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen that replace the common forms. When researchers sample their urine several times over 1 week, the labeled hydrogen passes through the body into urine, sweat, and other fluids, but as a person burns calories, some of the labeled oxygen is exhaled as CO2. The ratio of labeled oxygen to labeled hydrogen in the urine thus serves as a measure of how much oxygen a person's cells used on average in a day, and therefore how many calories were burned. In 2008, Ponser got a grant to study orangutans, and he found that they burned 1/3 of the energy expected for a mammal their size. This was totally unexpected. Subsequent double-labeled water studies of apes in captivity and in sanctuaries shattered the consensus view that mammals all have similar metabolic rates when adjusted for body mass. Among great apes, humans are the outlier. When adjusted for body mass, we burn 20% more energy per day than chimps and bonobos, 40% more than gorillas, and 60% more than orangutans. Ponser says the difference in body fat is just as shocking. Human males pack on twice as much fat as other male apes, and women 3 times as much as other female apes. He thinks our hefty body fat developed in tandem with our faster metabolic rate. Fat burns less energy than lean tissue and provides a fuel reserve. Our metabolic engines were not crafted by millions of years of evolution to guarantee a beach-ready bikini body. Our ability to convert food and fat stores into energy faster than other apes has important payoffs, however. It gives us more energy every day so we can fuel our big brains, as well as feed and protect offspring with long, energetically costly childhoods. Panzer got a lesson in the value of food sharing in 2010 when he traveled to Tanzania to study the energy budgets of the Hadza hunter-gatherers. One of the first things he noticed was how often the Hadza used the word za, meaning to give. It's the magic word all Hadza learn as children to get someone to share berries, honey, or other foods with them. Such sharing helps all the Hadza to be active. As they hunt and forage, Hadza women walk about 8 kilometers daily, men 14 kilometers, more than the typical American walks in a week. To learn about their energy expenditure, Panzer asked the Hadza whether they'd drink his tasteless water cocktail and give urine samples. They agreed. He almost couldn't get funding for the study because other researchers assumed the answer was obvious. Everyone knew the Hadza had exceptionally high energy expenditures because they were so physically active, except they didn't. Individual Hadza had days of more or less activity, and some burned 10% more or less calories than average. But when adjusted for non-fat body mass, Hadza men and women burned the same amount of energy per day on average as men and women in the United States, as well as those in Europe, Russia, and Japan. It's very surprising when you consider the differences in physical activity. One person who wasn't surprised was epidemiologist Amy Lake at Loyola University in Chicago. She'd already gotten a similar result with doubly labeled water studies showing female farmers in Western Africa use the same amount of energy daily when adjusted for fat-free body mass as women in Chicago, about 2,400 calories for a 75-kilogram woman. She says her work was not well known until Panzer's paper made the splash. The two have collaborated ever since. Panzer thinks hunter-gatherers' bodies adjust for more activity by spending fewer calories on other unseen tasks, such as inflammation and stress responses. Instead of increasing the calories burned per day, Panzer maintains that the Hadza's physical activity was changing the way they spend their calories. He backed this up with a new analysis of data from another team's study of sedentary women trained to run half marathons. After weeks of training, they barely burned more energy per day when they were running 40 kilometers per week than before they started to train. The body adjusted. In another study of marathoners who ran 42.6 kilometers daily, 6 days per week for 140 days in the race across the USA, Panzer and his colleagues found the runners burned gradually less energy over time, 4,900 calories per day at the end of the race compared with 6,200 calories at the start. Somehow their metabolic engines cut back elsewhere to make room for the extra energy costs. Panzer says, conversely, if you're a couch potato, you might still spend almost as many calories daily, leaving more energy for your body to spend on internal processes, such as a stress response. This is Panzer's most controversial and interesting idea, says Harvard paleoanthropologist Daniel Lieberman. This morning, I ran about 5 miles. I spent about 500 calories running. In a very simplistic model, that would mean my TEE would be 500 calories higher. According to Herman Panzer, humans who are more active don't have that much higher a TEE as you'd expect, but we still don't know why or how that occurs. So these findings have a discouraging implication for people wanting to lose weight. You can't exercise your way out of obesity. John Speakman of the Chinese Academy of Sciences has said it's one of those zombie ideas that refuses to die. But really, that's a different issue. This message may do more harm than good. People who exercise are less likely to gain weight in the first place, and those who exercise while they diet tend to keep weight off better, he says. Exercise also can impact where fat is stored on the body, and the risk of diabetes and heart disease definitely changes with exercise. Getting back to Panzer and the Hadza people, people of this tribe are active and fit into their 70s and 80s. They don't get diabetes and they don't get heart disease. Panzer says if exercise is tamping down the stress response, that compensation is a good thing. Meanwhile, last year, Poncer and Speakman co-led an effort to assemble a remarkable new resource, the International Atomic Energy Agency doubly labeled water database. Well, that's a mouthful. This includes existing doubly labeled water studies of almost 6,800 people between the ages of 8 days and 95 years. They used the database to do the first comprehensive study of human energy use over the lifespan. Again, a popular assumption was at stake, that teenagers and pregnant women have higher metabolisms. But Poncer found that it was toddlers who are the dynamos. Newborns have the same metabolic rate as their pregnant mothers, which is no different from other women when adjusted for body size. But between the ages of 9 and 15 months, babies expend 50% more energy in a day than do adults when adjusted for body size and fat. That's likely to fuel their growing brain and perhaps developing immune systems. The findings reported in Science help explain why malnourished infants may show stunted growth. Children's metabolisms stay high when adjusted for body size until about the age of 5, when they begin a slow decline until age 20 and stabilize in adulthood. Humans begin to use less energy at age 60, and by age 90, elders use 26% less than middle-aged adults. Poncer is now probing another mystery. There seems to be a hard limit on how many calories our bodies can burn per day, set by how fast we can digest food and turn it into energy, a process itself which consumes energy. So there's a diminishing returns that's kind of built in. He calculates that the ceiling for an 85-kilogram man would be about 4,600 calories daily. Others say that limit is too low, noting that cyclists in the Tour de France in the 80s and 90s exceeded it, but they were injecting fat and glucose directly into their bloodstreams. This practice, Poncer thinks, may have helped them bypass the physiologic limits I just mentioned on converting food into energy. I want to point out that you've got to read the methods section. I had no idea that there was a limit to the absolute number of calories that people could manage to consume in a day. What's going on? Well, Poncer and his students are exploring how the body tamps down other activities. I think we're going to find these adjustments lower inflammation, lower stress reaction. We do it to make the energy books balance. This reminds me of some of the research on the common cold. I believe it was a study, the one I'm thinking of, was done in elite athletes who were engaging in swim competitions. And, of course, if anybody in the swimming pool's got a cold, there's going to be an exposure to virus across the board, plus, of course, in the real world outside of the swimming pool. And what they found was that people were something like 14% more likely to get a cold after a intense competition. Getting back to Christina, our hapless undergraduate student he tortured in the first part of this story. After the test, Christina said she definitely was stressed, and her heart rate went from 75 to 80 beats per minute all the way up to 115. Her energy use rose from 1.2 kilocalories per minute to as much as 1.7 kilocalories per minute. She burned 40% more energy in the math test and about 30% in the interview, Poncer says. Think about any other process that boosts your energy by 40%. He hopes that data points like hers will help reveal the hidden cost of mental stress. It makes me think about stress eating. Maybe it's not just a psychological reaction, but a temporary adaptation that the person is cued by their brain to make, given that the increased stress is burning so much more energy. Something to think about. Well, that's about all for this week's podcast. Please go to AskDrDawn.com for news about our future plans. For now, this is Dr. Dawn saying so long and stay healthy.
Ask Dr. Dawn is brought to you by Jiva Media. Production and editing by Charles Bansky. Music by John Scoville.